You are a tank commander realizing your machine spirit hates you. I was the charioteer of the God Emperor's wrath. I knew every sacred psalm, every anointed bolt of the hull, every whispered prayer that coaxed obedience from ancient steel. Now I sit inside the belly of my tank and understand, with a clarity that feels surgical and cold, that the machine has always been listening, not with devotion, with hunger. What is a commander when the weapon he loves has decided, with patient and ancient deliberation, to consume him? #AT. 1. The charioteer. The first thing you learn when they assign you a Lehman Russ is that it breathes. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that the Ministorum priests use when they speak of sacred machinery as though it were scripture-given form. I mean that on the morning of your first communion with the vehicle, if you press your bare palm flat against the glass's plate before the blessed rituals of ignition, you will feel something move beneath the armoplacent ceramite, a slow, deep rhythm, a systolic pulse, faint as a dying man's heartbeat, traveling through 7 centimeters of layered battle plate as though the steel itself were muscle wrapped around a mechanical heart. The Adeptus Mechanicus engine seer, assigned to our regiment, a desiccated figure named Magos Auxilia Torvin Haas, told me this sensation was a sign of the machine spirit's wakefulness. He said it with the reverence of a man, identifying a saint's remains. He pressed his own augmetic hand to the hull and closed his remaining biological eye, and his vox grill emitted a low harmonic tone that I later learned was a canticle of greeting. I pressed my palm to the same spot and felt the pulse and thought, "This is alive. This is mine." My name is Sergeant Commander Aldrich Voss, formerly of the 114th Cadian Armored, now the sole crewman of the Lehman Russ Exterminatus pattern, designated Hull 7 Delta Mortis, which the regiment had long ago nicknamed the Confessor. I have been its commander for 6 years, 2 months, and 11 days. I have maintained a running log of every engagement, every maintenance cycle, every mechanical anomaly, and corrective ritual, because that is what a good commander does. Because the machine deserves the dignity of a record. Because I believed, without reservation, that the relationship between a tanker and his vehicle was the most sacred compact in the imperial military, a bond forged by shared survival, maintained through devotion, and honored through the meticulous application of machine rights. I believe this the way a man believes in the ground beneath his feet. In those early years, the log entries are almost embarrassing in their enthusiasm. Reading them now, I can see the handwriting of a man who had found his purpose and wrapped it around himself like armor. The script is precise, the observations detailed, the emotional undercurrent barely concealed beneath layers of technical language. Entry 14, dated 3 months after assignment, hull temperature at operational threshold, targeting spirit responsive, secondary cogitator cycling at 97.3% efficiency. The Confessor ran well today. There is a satisfaction in this work that I do not have words adequate to describe. Entry 29, Magos Haas performed the rite of realignment on the main battle cannon breech assembly. I assisted, learning the canticles. The machine spirit responded to my recitation. I felt the whole tremble. Haas said this was a good sign. Entry 47, survived the assault on Varicol Station. The Confessor absorbed 3 hits from Heretic Basilisk counter-battery fire. Hull integrity maintained. I ran my hands along the blast scoring after the battle and understood something I cannot fully articulate. This machine endured for me. I owe it everything. That last entry, that specific turn of phrase, it returns to me now with the weight of a diagnosis. I owe it everything. The Confessor was an old machine by any regimental standard. Its chassis bore the marks of at least 4 previous wars, the hull paint layered in strata, like geological sediment, each color belonging to a different regiment, a different era, a different commander. Beneath the current Cadian ochre and black was a deep arterial red that Magos Haas identified as belonging to the Talern Desert Raiders. Beneath that, a gray-green the shade of river silt. Beneath that, a gray-green the shade of river silt, a color that had no regimental designation in any record Haas could access. A blue so dark it was almost the color of a bruise, which he noted with professional discomfort before declining to speculate further. Each previous commander had left some mark, votive parchments bolted beneath the crew compartment hatch, honor badges riveted above the driver's position, a single silk ribbon, faded to near invisibility, tied around a hydraulic conduit inside the turret that I always left undisturbed because I did not know whose it was, and it seemed wrong to remove another man's memory from a machine that had kept him alive, or had it. I did not ask that question then. Then I was at my zenith, at the peak of what 6 years of intensive service had made me. I knew the confessor the way a musician knows an instrument. I knew the precise torque required on the main cannon elevation gear before it would catch and hold without slipping. I knew that the secondary hull-mounted bolter had a fractional lag of approximately 0.3 seconds between trigger pull and discharge, a lag that Haas had corrected 17 times and which always returned, as though the weapon preferred its own rhythm. I knew that the forward hull sensors ran approximately 4 degrees hot in humid atmospheres, and that the targeting cogitator would compensate incorrectly for this drift unless the operator manually input a correction during the pre-engagement litanies. I knew these things not from the technical manuals, though I had memorized those too, but from presence, from the accumulated physical knowledge of a man who spent more waking hours inside a machine than outside it. The engagement at Hive-Pellucid Tertius was where I reached the summit, the battle I will point to, in the archive of my own memory, as the moment when everything I had built reached its apex and held there, suspended, perfect, for exactly long enough for me to feel it before it began its descent. A mechanized counter-assault. 3 Chaos-corrupted Predator tanks breaking through the secondary defensive line, targeting the artillery positions that were keeping the main push suppressed. My squadron was positioned to intercept, but the squadron leader's vehicle had taken a tread hit and was immobile. The other crews were newer, less integrated with their machines. The calculus was simple, it fell to me. I remember the engagement in segments of data, hull temperature, 61 degrees Celsius, high but within operational tolerance. Targeting, reticle acquisition, first Predator locked at 847 meters, moving at 23 kA on a bearing of 112 degrees. Main cannon shell type. Armor-piercing high explosive, standard load. I ran the correction for the sensor drift from memory. I recited the litany of true aim in a murmur, not from compulsion but from the deep physical habit of a man who had learned that the recitation and the performance were inseparable, that the machine listened and responded, and that the relationship was real and reciprocal. The confessor fired. The first Predator ceased to exist as a coherent object. The shell found the join between turret ring and hull, a gap of perhaps 15 centimeters at maximum, at a range of 847 meters, while both vehicles were in motion. The turret separated and fell. The hull burned. We traversed. The second Predator was already turning to engage. The targeting cogitator lost acquisition for 1.2 seconds as the corrupted tank's heat signature spiked with some unholy emanation that confused the machine's spirit. I corrected manually, overriding the cogitator's confusion with direct mechanical input, reading the range by instinct, by the remembered geometry of 1,000 hours of practice. The confessor fired again. The second Predator died. The third tried to run. We ran it down. After the battle, when the hull had cooled to 43 degrees, and the crew had emerged, and the regimental commissar had made the appropriate notations, I sat inside the driver's compartment, alone. The crew had gone to receive their rations and whatever thin comfort a Cadian soldier allows himself after survival. I stayed. I pressed my palm to the interior hull beside the cogitator panel and felt the pulse. Slower now, the deep systolic rhythm of a machine at rest. And I felt, emanating through my palm and up my arm, into something that was not quite a physical sense, a quality I had learned to interpret as satisfaction. The machine was pleased. I wrote in my log that evening, Hive-Pellucid Tertius engagement complete. 3 enemy armored units destroyed. No friendly casualties attributable to this vehicle. The confessor performed with a precision that exceeded all technical parameters. I have never felt more certain that this machine knows me, that we understand each other. Whatever a machine spirit truly is, I believe ours is content. I am content. This is the purpose I was made for. That entry is the loss, T1 in the log that does not contain the word anomaly. The ###AT2, the detachment. The anomalies began small. They always do when something is ending. Entry 201, approximately 3 weeks after Pellucid Tertius. Targeting reticle drift noted during morning calibration. Lateral displacement of 0.7 milliradians over a 30-second acquisition window. Within acceptable parameters. Recited the right of steady aim. Drift corrected. Flagged from Agog's Hass's review during next scheduled maintenance cycle. Times, entry 207 reticle drift recurring. Pattern consistent leftward deviation, magnitude increasing. Now 1.1 milliradians over the same window. Hass examined the targeting cogitator assembly and found no mechanical fault. He performed the blessing of unwavering sight and reported the machine spirit appeared settled. The drift was present again within 4 hours. Times, entry 214 Hass has performed 3 separate diagnostic rites on the targeting assembly. No fault found. He suggests the machine spirit may be expressing displeasure with some aspect of the maintenance schedule and recommends increased votive offerings. I have complied, the drift continues. I am beginning to note a pattern in the direction of deviation that I find difficult to fully articulate. The reticle does not drift randomly. It drifts consistently toward the crew compartment. I read that last line now and feel the retrospective chill of a man who saw the diagnosis written clearly in the data and chose to record it in clinical language rather than confront what it meant. The reticle drifting toward the crew compartment. The barrel of the Confessor's main cannon deviating during calibration locks toward the interior space where the crew lived and breathed and trusted. At the time I wrote it as an anomaly, a curiosity. A datum requiring further observation. Magos Hass examined the hull 4T IMS over the following weeks. He is a thorough man, or was, by the standards of his kind. He ran diagnostics that his augmetics conducted in frequencies I could not perceive, running hands that were more sensor array than flesh over every accessible surface of the targeting assembly. He performed 11 separate ritual rites. He replaced 2 cogitator subcomponents that he deemed potentially degraded, sourcing the replacement parts from the regimental stores with evident reluctance, as though the act of replacing original components was a form of violence against the machine's integrity. The drift persisted, worsened, in its slow and patient way. Entry 229, Operational Engagement, Unreach Morden, Secondary. The targeting drift required manual correction during the engagement. I compensated successfully. The engagement was completed without incident, but I note, for the record, that the correction required greater conscious effort than at any previous point in my service with this vehicle. I was aware of the records pulled during the engagement. The targeting spirit was not assisting. It was resisting. That word. Resisting. I wrote it, and then sat for a long time with my stylus hovering over the page, wondering whether to cross it out and replace it with something more technically neutral. I did not. It was the accurate word. Whatever was happening with the targeting assembly, it had ceased to feel like mechanical fault and had begun to feel like opposition, the crew noticed. Gunner Specialist Aaron Veth, a quiet man from a family with 3 generations of armored service, said nothing directly but began performing additional personal rites at his station each morning, a practice I had not observed in him during our previous 6 years together. Driver Specialist Polia Davin, who was the crew's appointed keeper of the small shrine mounted above her position, Rep. Laced the incense there with a heavier grade blend that Magos Hass told me, when I asked, was traditionally used in rites of appeasement, not maintenance. Appeasement. They did not say so. Cadians do not say such things directly, but the evidence was in their behavior, and I was their commander, and I read their behavior as I read all data, precisely and without the comfort of ignorance. I attempted to return to the communion, the early hours of the morning, before the crew woke, before the regimental day began. I would sit inside the confessor alone and perform the extended rites of greeting and gratitude that Hass had taught me in the first months of my service. I would press my palm to the hull and feel the pulse. I would speak the canticles. I would wait. The pulse was there. It had always been there. But something in its quality had changed, and I struggled for weeks to find language adequate to describe the change until, in a sleepless hour at 0340 on the morning of entry 244, the right word came to me. The pulse had become watchful. Not the slow, satisfied rhythm of a machine at rest. Not the quickened, purposeful beat of a machine engaged in its purpose. Something else, a rhythm that felt oriented, directed. A pulse that felt, in the way that a pulse beneath a palm can feel anything at all, like the heartbeat of an animal that has identified its prey and is waiting, with all the patience of ancient steel, for the right moment to move. Entry 244, I am changing. I recognize the signs, because I have been trained to recognize them in others. The detachment I feel when inside this vehicle is not professional composure. It is something else. Something essential in my relationship with the confessor is leaving, and in its place is something I do not have a technical designation for. Caution is insufficient. Fear is imprecise. The closest analog is the feeling a soldier reports after the third or fourth engagement. The understanding no longer theoretical, that the thing that has kept you alive can just as easily end you, and that the distinction between the two outcomes may not be entirely within your control. I wrote that and then performed the ritual closing of the log with my usual precision. Date, time, hull temperature recorded at 34 degrees Celsius, crew status nominal, machine status listed as operational with noted anomalies. The anomalies column had grown to fill its own separate page when #AT3, the auto-pay patch crack 2, have a can researching the machine spirit on day 251 of the anomaly log, not the general doctrine. I had memorized that long ago, as any serious commander does, the cult mechanicus's positions on machine spirit taxonomy, the degrees of sentience attributed to varying classes of vehicle, the approved rites for each category of communion and correction. I knew the approved texts. I had applied them faithfully for 6 years and 2 months. They were no longer sufficient. I went deeper. Magos Haas had a field archive, a collection of data slates and physical texts that he carried in a battered crate of stamped steel, the contents of which he had never offered to share, and which I had never previously presumed to request access to. I requested access. He studied me for a long moment with his one biological eye and one augmetic lens, the latter cycling through visible spectra in a way that I had learned indicated processing and assessment. And then he unlocked the crate. He said, "You should know that some of what is in here is not approved reading for non-mechanicus personnel." He paused. "You should also know that I am showing it to you, because I believe you have already reached the correct conclusion, and that ignorance will not protect you." He left me alone. Wit achieves the archive for 2 hours. The first text I found relevant was a mechanicus field treatise on machine spirit degradation in long-service vehicles, classified at a level that made me understand why it was not in the general regimental library. The language was typically opaque, laden with technolingo that I had to parse slowly, but the core content was clear enough. Machine spirits, in vehicles of sufficient age and operational history, develop what the treatise termed accumulative experiential imprinting. This was described, in the careful neutral language of mechanicus doctrine, as the machine spirit's absorption of the psychological residue of its operators over time. Years of fear, pain, purpose, devotion, violence, and survival leave a mark on the machine spirit the way water leaves a mark on stone. Slowly, imperceptibly, and permanently. The treatise did not use the word personality. It used the term operational disposition matrix, but the meaning was the same. Then I found the second text. This one was older, its physical pages brittle with age, the script written in a hand I did not recognize, the provenance unstated. It was not a mechanicus treatise. It was something more personal, a record kept by a tech priest of an earlier era, possibly N38 based on dating notations in the margins. In the margins, concerning his long-term observation of a layman Russ that he identified only as the subject. The record described, in meticulous and increasingly distressed detail, a vehicle whose machine spirit had undergone what the author termed inversive dedication. I read the definition 3 times to be certain I understood it. Inversive dedication, a state in which a machine spirit, having absorbed sufficient operator imprinting over multiple generations of use, develops a form of purposive attachment to the act of consuming its operators rather than protecting them. The machine spirit does not malfunction, it does not degrade, it evolves in the specific and terrible direction of its accumulated experience, toward a state in which the suffering and death of those it carries becomes, in whatever sense a machine spirit can be said to desire anything, its primary operational objective. The author wrote, in a marginal notation that was shakier than the main text, it does not hate them. Hate is a human conception. It has learned to need them in the way that a flame needs fuel. The machine spirit has discovered that operators burn so beautifully. I set the text down. I noted with the part of my mind that never stops recording that my hands were steady, that the temperature of the archive tent was 19 degrees Celsius, that outside the regimental camp was quiet except for the distant sound of someone performing night watch drills, that it was 0127 hours. I sat in silence for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which I know because I was watching the chronometer on my wrist. Then I picked up the text again. The tech priest's record detailed a progression that I recognized with a precision that should have been impossible: the initial targeting anomalies, the recidal drift, the machine spirit's apparent shift from assistance to resistance during engagements. Then a new phase, environmental hostility within the vehicle itself. Hull temperatures running high without mechanical explanation, hatch seals behaving unpredictably, the internal vox link carrying sounds between stations that were not the voices of the crew. The tech priest documented all of this with increasing clinical desperation, the language becoming more fragmentary as the record progressed, the observations becoming more personal, the professional distance dissolving as understanding replaced it. His final entry: the vehicle has consumed 4 crews across its operational history. I have now confirmed this through cross-referencing regimental records that list each crew as lost in action, a designation that is technically accurate. They were lost inside the action of being inside it. I do not know if I can stop it. I do not know if the mechanicus will permit me to stop it. A vehicle with this much operational history, this many confirmed kills, this many years of service, is too valuable. The machine spirit is too old. They will call it temperamental and reassign another crew and begin the cycle again. All I can do is record what I have seen, so that if someone else finds themselves where I am now, they will understand what is happening to them before it is too late to make any meaningful choice. Times 4 previous crews. I thought of the silk ribbon tied around the hydraulic conduit. I closed the archive and went to find Magos Haas. He was performing maintenance on his own augmetics in the low light of his tent, which smelled of machine oil and incense. The 2 scents so intermingled as to be indistinguishable. He did not look up when I entered. He said, "You found the tech priest's record?" "Yes. I have read it 11 times over the years." He set down his tools. There is a word in the old technolingua for what the confessor is: carnavex animus, devouring spirit. It is considered an apocryphal designation by the Mechanicus orthodoxy. They prefer not to acknowledge that machine spirits can develop in this direction, because acknowledgement would require action, and the vehicle is too valuable to retire. How many crews? He was quiet for a moment. The regimental records list 6. I believe the true number is higher. Hull 7 Delta Mortis has served in some capacity since approximately M38. The records become fragmentary. I stood in the entrance of his tent and looked at the distant shape of the confessor and Dick. Vehicle park, its hull barely visible in the darkness, its silhouette familiar as a shadow I had been standing inside for 6 years. "The drift," I said, the reticle drifting toward the crew compartment. "The machine spirit is aiming," Haas said. "It has been aiming for some time. It does so slowly because patience is, as best I can determine, the primary characteristic of its developed disposition. It does not want to simply kill you. It wants the full experience. It wants to be occupied, operated, trusted, and then it wants to consume that trust from the inside out. The psychological dimension precedes the physical, always. I noted, clinically, that my heart rate was elevated, estimated 94 beats per minute against my resting norm of 67. I noted that the night air was 11 degrees Celsius. I noted that the silk ribbon on the hydraulic conduit was not the relic of a crewman who had died in battle. It was a relic of a crewman who had died inside the machine that I slept aside, maintained with devotion, and called mine. Hass looked at me with his one human eye, and in it was an expression that I had not previously seen in him, something that looked, in a mechanicus engenseer, almost like grief. You can report the anomalies formally and request vehicle reassignment. The vehicle will be assigned to another crew. The cycle continues. He paused. Or you can remain. The machine spirit has chosen you specifically, you understand. It has invested considerable patience. It will not simply redirect its attention if you leave. It will wait. That is not an option, I said. That is not a choice I can make. No, he said. I did not think it was. I went back to the archive, and I read everything else in the crate that was relevant, which took the rest of the night and part of the following morning. I read technical notations and tech priest journals and one document that was not catalogued and that Hass later claimed not to know was in his crate, written in a script that was neither Gothic nor Technolinga and that I could only partially parse, but which seemed to describe the process by which a machine spirit of sufficient age and accumulated imprinting achieves what it called the terminal communion, a state in which the consumption of an operator is not merely purposive, but constitutes the machine spirit's highest expression of its evolved nature. The document used the word beloved, applied to the crew being consumed. In the morning I returned to the confessor and sat inside it alone, and pressed my palm to the hull and felt the pulse, which was, as it had been for weeks, watchful, directed, patient. And for the first time in 6 years of service, I said clearly into the empty interior of the crew compartment, I know what you are. The pulse did not change. The temperature did not spike. Nothing moved. Outside, the regimental camp was beginning to wake with the sounds of morning routines, engines being coaxed to life, cook fires lit, the distant bark of drill abbots moving early risers. But I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the accumulated data of 6 years of intimate presence, that the confessor had heard me, and that it was not concerned. Act 4. The Phenol Spectamen. The engagement order came down on day 263 of the anomaly log. I had spent the 12 intervening days in a state that I can only describe as the performance of normalcy. I performed the morning rites. I conducted crew briefings. I maintained the log with my usual precision. I ate, slept, consulted with Magos Hass on the ongoing anomaly documentation. Hass had formally filed the anomalies with the Regimental Technical Authority, using language carefully. C. Calibrated to indicate concern without triggering the specific category of response that would result in the crew being reassigned and the machine reclassified as temperamental and passed on. He was buying time, he told me. For what purpose he could not specify, because the purpose would require a decision that only I could make. The engagement order was for a breakthrough operation, armored assault across the Reach Morden primary defensive line, supporting infantry advancing on the central hive spire. Heavy resistance expected. All available armored assets committed. I briefed the crew. Veth listened with his quiet attentiveness, the kind that I had come to recognize as concealing something he did not want to say. Davin performed the pre-engagement ritual at her shrine with a focus that was technically appropriate, but too intense, the way a person prays when they do not entirely believe the prayer will be answered. Loader Specialist Carrick, who had been with the crew for only 8 months, was too new to know enough to be afraid in the right ways. I did not tell them what I knew. I have asked myself in the days since whether this was a failure of command. I have concluded that it was not, or not entirely. What I knew was not something I could communicate in a pre-engagement briefing without inducing a paralysis that would be fatal in a different way. What I knew required a choice, and the choice was mine alone, because I was the commander and the machine spirit had chosen me, and the two facts were inseparable. We mounted up at 0600, hull temperature at engine start, 43 degrees Celsius, targeting cogitator cycling through pre-engagement calibration. I ran the correction for the drift manually, as I had done for weeks. The reticle steadied to within acceptable parameters. The Confessor's engine, a great Lemon Russ power plant of immense and ancient authority. 2. Runned over with the heavy rhythmic authority of a machine that has been starting and stopping for centuries, and regards the process with something very close to contempt for how easy it is. We moved out. For the first 40 minutes of the advance, everything was almost normal. The engagement was fierce but not unusual. Infantry moving in broken ground, and armored support providing suppression and breakthrough capability, the coordinated violence of imperial military doctrine made manifest in smoke and noise and the concussive percussion of tank cannons firing. My crew performed. I performed. The Confessor performed. The drift was there. I corrected for it automatically, without conscious thought. 1.4 milliradians now, consistent leftward pull toward the crew compartment. I corrected. I fired. The reticle drifted. I corrected again. It was on the 43rd minute that the first truly new anomaly presented. The forward hull hatch, which was dogged closed in combat position and which required a specific sequence of mechanical actions to unseal from inside, disengaged. Not opened. The dogs turned. The seal pressure released. The hatch shifted on its hinges by approximately 2 centimeters. Not enough to open, enough to compromise the seal. In a combat environment, this meant two things. First, a vulnerability in the vehicle's protective integrity. Second, and more immediately relevant, a drop in internal pressure that caused the internal atmospheric management system to log the discrepancy and alert me via a chime in my headset. Internal pressure logged. Hatch seal status compromised. Hull integrity reduced. I noted this. I did not move to reseal it, because doing so required leaving my position at the commander's cupola, and we were in an active engagement, and leaving my position was not a tactically sound decision at that moment. I logged the anomaly and Conti, new directing the engagement. The hatch redogged itself. Not through any crew action, not through mechanical rebound or pressure differential. The dogs turned, in sequence, the correct mechanical sequence, as though operated by hands, and the seal repressurized, and the hatch was closed again. The internal log updated. Hatch seal status, nominal. Hull integrity, restored. The engagement continued. On the 51st minute, the hull temperature spiked, not the gradual rise of an engine working hard in a high-intensity environment. A spike. The internal temperature monitor recorded a jump from 61 degrees Celsius to 74 degrees in under 90 seconds. This is not a temperature that is immediately lethal. It is a temperature at which sustained exposure becomes dangerous, at which efficiency drops, at which the physical and cognitive performance of unaugmented human crew members begins to degrade. I called for the internal cooling cycle. The cooling system did not respond. I ran the override sequence. The override registered in the cogitator but produced no physical effect. The cooling vanes, which I could hear in normal operation as a low whirring beneath the engine noise, were silent. I called to Carrick, positioned at the loader's station, adjacent to the engine compartment access, and told him to manually actuate the cooling system emergency bypass. He moved to do so. He reported that the bypass lever was not responding. He applied more force. Still nothing. 74 degrees. 76 degrees. The temperature was rising slowly but continuously, like water finding its level, like something being patient about it. And here is the moment that I have returned to in every reconstruction, every clinical re-examination of the event sequence. The moment that I believe the tech priest's ancient record was written to describe, and that Magos Hass's expression of grief. was directed at, and that the silk ribbon on the hydraulic conduit was the last communication of a crewman who had reached his same moment and understood it too late. Not its usual drift. Not the slow 1.4 milliradian leftward pull that I had been correcting for weeks. A deliberate, full-magnitude slew. The reticle moved from its acquisition lock on an enemy position approximately 340 meters ahead of our position and traversed, fully, with the purposive precision of a targeting system operating exactly as designed, to center on the inside of the crew compartment forward bulkhead. The main battle cannon was not traversed. The turret was still facing forward, but the targeting reticle, which is the targeting cogitator's representation of where the weapon system is aimed, was showing me, clearly, precisely, without any mechanical ambiguity, exactly where the confessor had decided to fire. At us. 78 degrees. The heat was becoming a physical weight. Veth was sweating through his uniform. Davin had one hand on the driving controls and one hand, I saw, on the emergency driver's hatch release. Carrick was still wrestling with the cooling bypass, his movements becoming less coordinated as the heat worked on him. I sat very still. I have replayed this moment many times since, attempting to identify what I felt in it, because I believe accuracy on this point matters. Not fear, or not primarily. Something closer to the feeling that the Tech Prius record had described and that I had not fully credited until now. The feeling of being seen. Completely, specifically, intimately seen. The machine knew me. It had always known me. The 6 years of communion, of daily presence, of pressed palms and whispered canticles, and the careful learning of every mechanical idiosyncrasy, the sensor drift and the firing lag, and the way the engine settled into a D. Per timber at high operational load, all of it had been reciprocal. I had been learning the machine. The machine had been learning me, and it had learned me in order to understand exactly how to consume me most thoroughly. The temperature continued to rise. The choice was exactly as Haas had described it, not between good and evil, but between two forms of emptiness. I could attempt to dismount, to order the crew out through the emergency hatches. The machine would resist this. The hatch anomaly had already demonstrated its capability to manipulate the seals. Even if we succeeded in dismounting in an active combat zone, we would be outside our armor in a firefight, which had its own highly specific fatality probability. Or I could remain. Stay in the commander's position. Ride out whatever the confessor was preparing, trusting to some combination of luck and the machine spirit's own inscrutable timing. Trust, in other words, the thing that had been building this moment for 6 years. The targeting reticle remained centered on the crew compartment forward bulkhead. I made my choice. I keyed the internal Vox. Channel 1, crew only. Dismount. Emergency hatches. Now, Davin moved instantly. The training in her was older than any fear. Carrick followed. Veth paused for one beat, his eyes finding mine through the crew compartment, and I saw in his face the specific expression of a man who has reached the same conclusion as his commander and is asking, without words, if he should stay. I shook my head once. He went. I stayed. The hatch they went through opened, the machine let them out. I have spent considerable time since considering this fact. The machine let them out. It allowed my crew to dismount and closed the hatch behind the last of them. Not because it was unable to stop them. Because it was not interested in them. It was interested in me. The temperature. E spiked again. 83 degrees. 87. The heat was extraordinary. A physical presence, thick and purposive, filling the crew compartment with the weight of it. I was sweating in a way that was no longer a simple physical response, but a systemic event. My body working frantically against a temperature that was exceeding safe operational parameters for unaugmented human physiology. My vision was narrowing. My cognition was beginning to slow in the specific clinical way that is the first symptom of heat incapacitation. Thoughts taking longer to complete, the gap between stimulus and response widening. But I was still recording, still noting, still with the last and most durable part of what I am observing. The hull temperature monitor read 91 degrees when the targeting reticle, which had been locked on the forward bulkhead throughout, began to move again. Slowly, not a slew this time, a deliberate, graduated traversal, like a weapon being laid onto a specific point with extreme care. The reticle moved across the internal schematic representation until it centered precisely on my position, on the commander's station, on me. The pulse was there, but it was not the watchful pulse of the preceding weeks. It was something else. Fast and strong and resonant, a rhythm that felt through the insulation of steel and ceramite, like eagerness, like recognition, like the physical expression of a hunger that had been cultivated across decades and was now, finally, present at its satisfaction. I said, quietly, to the empty crew compartment, "I see you too." The temperature reached 94 degrees, and then the engine died, not a failure, not a malfunction. The power plant of the Confessor, that great and ancient machine, simply ceased. The cogitators went dark. The temperature monitors went dark. The targeting cogitator went dark, taking the reticle with it. The hum of active systems that is the constant background of a vehicle in operation faded to nothing, and in the nothing was a silence so complete it had a texture. The hull cooled, slowly, with the patience of ancient metal releasing stored heat into a world that would accept it. The emergency pressure seals on the commander's hatch released of their own accord, and the hatch swung open above me, and the outside air came in, and it tasted of smoke and promethium and the specific mineral sharpness of recently disturbed soil, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever breathed. I climbed out. My hands were shaking. My uniform was soaked through. The combat was ongoing somewhere to my left, the percussion of it muffled by the blood moving loudly in my ears. Magos Haas was standing beside the vehicle. He had, by what mechanism I do not know, arrived at the Confessor during or immediately after the engine failure. He was pressing both hands, flesh and augmetic, flat against the hull, and his Vox grill was producing a sound I had not heard from him before. A long, low harmonic that could have been a diagnostic tone, or could have been something else entirely. I stood beside him and looked at the dead vehicle. It stopped, I said. He did not move his hands from the hull. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I believe it made a calculation. You did not burn in the way it wanted. You understood what it was doing. You named it. You remained, not out of helplessness, but out of choice. I think this was not what it had prepared for. He paused again. A machine spirit that feeds on devotion and trust cannot easily consume a man who has replaced his devotion with clear sight. The fuel changed. The fire went out. I looked at the hull. The familiar scoring of years of battle, the layers of paint strata, the votive parchments. Some in, some left by predecessors whose names I did not know. "It will start again," I said. "For a time," he agreed. "Perhaps a long time. The machine's spirit is old and patient." He finally removed his hands from the hull. But it has never before encountered a crew that saw it clearly and chose, in full knowledge, to stay long enough to deprive it of what it wanted. That will leave a mark. I thought about marks, about the silk ribbon, about layers of paint beneath layers of paint, each one a different commander, a different relationship, a different ending. "I want the ribbon removed from the hydraulic conduit," I said. "Whatever crew member left it there deserves to have their relic returned to the records, to be named." Haas nodded. "And then," I said, "I want a full machine spirit audit. Everything you have in that crate. Every notation. I want the regimental command to have a formal record of what this vehicle is and what it has done. I know." I looked at the Confessor one last time. "But the next commander will know what they are sitting in. They will have the record. They will have a choice." It was the only thing I could give them. The only relic I could leave inside the hull before whatever was next. #ACD5, The Echo. I am writing this from the Field Medicae station, where they have treated me for heat exposure and listed my status as fit for light duties pending full clearance. My hands have stopped shaking. The sweating stopped approximately 4 hours after the incident. My cognition has returned to what I assess as normal functional parameters, though I am aware that this assessment is being made by the same cognition being assessed, which is an epistemological limitation I note without being able to resolve. Hull 7 Delta Mortis has been restored to operational status. It took Magos, Haas, and Twin, O Mechanicus apprentices 9 hours of ritual work and technical examination to determine the cause of the power plant shutdown, and they could not find one. The engine restarted on the third attempt at ignition and has been running at full operational parameters since. The targeting cogitator shows no anomalies. The internal temperature management systems are functioning correctly. The hatch seals are operating within specification. The anomaly log shows clear. I have submitted my full report to Regimental Command, attached the relevant sections of Haas's archive, and formally requested that the vehicle's operational disposition matrix be reviewed at a command level above the regiment. I do not expect this to result in the vehicle's retirement. I expect it to result in a notation, a review, a series of meetings that generate documents that generate further meetings. The Imperium is very good at generating documents. It is less consistent about acting on them. The ribbon, as I requested, has been removed from the hydraulic conduit. Haas's archive, cross-referenced with regimental personnel records, identified it as belonging to Commander Sergeant Tess Valine of the 89th Cadian Armored, listed as killed in action during the siege of Arat Primaris, approximately 40 years before my assignment to the vehicle. She had served with Hull 7 Delta Mortis for 3 years. Her crew was listed as lost with her. The ribbon is now in the regimental record as her personal effect, and has been entered into the Book of Remembrance with the notation, "Crew of the Confessor, consumed by the machine they served." I do not know if the next commander will be as fortunate as I was. Fortune is perhaps not the right word. I am alive because I understood what the machine wanted and denied it the specific form of consumption it had prepared. This required 6 years of intimate knowledge, the archive of a reluctant tech priest, and the decision to remain inside a hostile machine long enough to understand its limitation. It is not a repeatable methodology. It required everything I had to offer, and it produced only an interruption, not a resolution. Not a resolution. The Confessor will find another commander. The machine's spirit will cultivate another relationship, patient as old steel. Slow as geological time, it will learn a new person's habits, their fears, the specific shape of their devotion. It will allow the relationship to grow, will cooperate and perform and provide the deep satisfaction of a machine that knows its operator. Until the knowing is sufficient, and the fuel is right, and the temperature begins to rise. And somewhere in the interior of that future engagement, another set of hands will press against the hull and feel the pulse, and the pulse will be watchful, and they may or may not know what it means. I can only hope the record I leave is clear enough, that the file is sufficiently detailed, that someone finds the tech priest's account in Haas's archive and reads it with the same cold precision with which I read it, and that the clinical language does not obscure what it is actually saying. That some machines learn to love their operators in the way a trap loves the thing that springs it, and that this love is patient and architectural and ancient and has nothing in its nature that resembles mercy. I said once that I owed the machine everything. The machine agreed. The difference between us was what we each understood the debt to mean. What is a charioteer who knows the chariot is driving? The same thing he was before he knew. A man inside a machine, responsible for every choice available to him, which have always been fewer than he believed and more consequential than he imagined. The knowledge does not free him. It does not restore the uncomplicated devotion of the early years, the simple communion of man and machine in shared purpose. That is gone. It was always conditional on ignorance, and ignorance has its own half-life. What the knowledge gives him, if he survives it, is clarity, the ability to see the relationship for what it is, not the sacred bond of operator and loyal weapon, but a negotiation between two forms of purpose, one organic and one mechanical, and both equally committed to their own survival, and neither entirely trustworthy, and both, in the final reckoning, alone inside the same steel shell. This is what I owe the machine, and what it owed me, and what we have, in our own terrible way, delivered to each other, the truth. I was the charioteer of the God Emperor's wrath. I knew every sacred psalm, every anointed bolt of the hull, every prayer that coaxed obedience from ancient steel. I know now that the machine was always listening. I know now what it heard. And I know, seated here in the Medicae station with the record open and my stylus in my hand, that the most dangerous thing the machine ever gave me was not the danger it prepared for me, but the 6 years of genuine purpose that preceded it, the authentic satisfaction of a man who believed he had found his place in the order of things and lived inside that belief with his whole self. That man is gone. What sits in his place is more accurate and colder and alive. The confessor is running in the vehicle park, 60 meters from where I am writing this. I can hear the engine from here. That deep, heavy authority, that right, that does not stop. I press my free hand flat against the Medicae station wall, which is cold, prefabricated metal, which has no pulse, and I feel the absence of it, and I understand, with a precision I could not have achieved before, exactly what I was pressing my hand against for 6 years. And I find that I am glad I know. Even now, even here, even if what I know is only this, that the pulse was never devotion. It was appetite, and I fed it, faithfully, every day, until the day I stopped. That is the only record worth leaving. That is the only ribbon worth tying. Log closed. Sergeant, Commander, Aldrich Vos, 114th Cadian Armored, Hull 7 Delta Mortis Operational Anomaly File, sealed. Status, alive. Sealed, for now. Dire. For what that still means.